Welcome to the latest episode of the Undiscovered Metric with me, JJ Haig. Today I'm joined by Amy Woods, CEO at Content 10x, a specialist content creations agency based in Manchester. Today we're speaking about the importance of measuring organic content with business metrics in mind, how to measure the impact of new channels, and the rise of zero-click content. Amy, thank you so much for joining me. Just before we get started, please could you just give our listeners and viewers a little bit of a rundown into your career history and your role at Content 10x?
Yeah, absolutely, JJ. And thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So a brief summary, a rundown. So I run Content 10x. So Content 10x is a content repurposing agency that will be celebrating its 6th birthday in a month or so. Before that, so I not a traditional career at all, I guess, in terms of the path that I've followed, because I was a management consultant actually. So I worked in Accenture for over a decade as a management consultant in the sort of banking and then tech industry, working on mergers and acquisitions and outsourcing programs. So not much to do with content. But then, you know, without going too much into the story, because it'd probably be a separate episode in its own right, but I decided to start my own business, didn't want to travel as much. Initially started doing like business consulting, what I knew, in an online capacity, trying to grow my personal brand, create content, things like that. And then discovered the gap of an agency that helps businesses with repurposing their content. So to me, I just saw this huge opportunity for businesses to focus on creating core pieces of content, like creating a video or a podcast or a webinar, and then having a reliable agency partner that they work with to do all of the maximization, repurposing of the content and distribution of it. And then, like, fast forward to today, as I mentioned, we're nearly 6 years old. We work with B2B businesses, predominantly like tech companies, also some professional services, but mainly tech and SaaS companies, doing exactly that. So helping to take content and then maximize, repurpose and distribute it to help it reach bigger and wider audiences. So that's me in a nutshell.
So every business, every marketer has a content strategy. They're always looking at producing content. There's thousands of bits of content that are produced every year. But how can a marketer at the beginning of that journey ensure that they're always hitting their business goals and aligning that content with the wider business goals and KPIs?
So I think firstly, it's really important to define what those business goals are. So to be really clear and working with, I guess, like the key people within the organization of what are those business goals. So for this year, is it new markets, new products, new brand positioning? So, what are they? So often I think sometimes that can initially be a bit of a challenge in terms of actually pinning down and understanding what the business goals are. Then I think it's around then knowing the target audience. So knowing exactly who you want to reach with your content, what the problems are that they have, what their pain points are. So when we know exactly what the business goals are, then we define our audience and know exactly who that audience is. So if it's to grow a particular product or service line, then who would we be talking to? Who is the audience for that? And what kind of content would we need to be creating for them? So, tying it back from an audience perspective, I think also doing a content audit. So looking at what data, what have you been doing so far? What data is available? What has been working? What hasn't been working so well? If you've tried to reach this audience before, if they're a audience that you've always been working with, then what has been working? Otherwise, look at what's worked with other audiences and try and draw some conclusions as to what may or may not work as you focus on a new and different audience. And then I think it comes down to defining the key message, defining the content plan, and working out from that content what measurement would then be in place. So what would we be able to measure? What would really move the needle with this content, tying back to the business strategy to make sure that we're all aligned. So, I think they're the key things. It's like, if we're going to align with the business strategy, exactly what is that? If we know what it is, exactly who is the target audience, let's do an audit of our content so far. Let's define what our key message is. Let's define what our content plan is, and then look at what is measurable within that content plan that can tie back to those original goals, and make sure that we have a reporting dashboard and metrics and measurement in place. And also, I guess, acknowledging as well that not everything is measurable, and also things that you can measure are not always going to be important and a focus. So not getting distracted on those things as well. Just because you can measure it doesn't mean you should get distracted by it. And not everything can be measured. So yeah.
And just to touch on that first point, when you're aligning on the business goals, do you need that champion from the top and working from sort of C-suite down? Rather, is it a cross-team project rather than just a marketing project and saying these are the goals we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, no, I think it is very much a cross team project, isn't it? Marketing is so closely aligned to, of course, sales and what we do into, enhance sales enablement and work together. And what's coming into our marketing, what messaging, who are we speaking to, what experts, things like that. So it's a fully sort of cross team, cross workforce, like a alignment that I think needs to happen to really make it shine, whether whoever the key stakeholders is, whether it's C-suite or whoever we need to be working with. But yeah, no, I think it's important to just make sure there's no silos in place when it comes to this kind of approach.
That's certainly something that we've seen, and I think once you get it right, you can get those real champions at the top, which really helps.
Yeah.
Um, Moving on to the second point that you made there around what's measurable and what's not.
Mm.
Obviously, the number of content touch points has grown massively over the last 5-10 years, even the last 2 years. You think of the rise of TikTok as a channel that we didn't necessarily have before. But have you seen a significant shift in client demands to newer channels such as sort of podcasting or video first strategy, and what are the learnings that people can take out of moving to those sort of new channels?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess for me, in the position that I am at Content 10x, we tend to work with businesses that, are very, I guess, kind of like modern and forward thinking with the content that they're creating, and businesses that are realizing that exhibiting a few sort of trade shows and things like that a couple of times a year or more, and occasionally updating a blog and doing some email marketing is not really but what we should be focusing on. It's not representative 2023 of like a more modern marketing approach, and probably not the best use of people's time to be spending so much on things like exhibiting and things like that, meeting people in person, which is important, but also all the other things that you can be doing to a much more one-to-many marketing approach. So we work with a lot of businesses that are doing things like virtual events, so growing audiences and running big virtual events, as well as in-person hybrid events, webinar series, having more of that video content, really. So whether it's a live webinar or pre-recorded webinars, but more video content, video podcasts as well, or just audio only podcasts. But yeah, a lot more of that multi-format, I guess, kind of multimedia content. And you mentioned touch point. I think that is something that is really, really important. So I was delivering a talk a couple of weeks ago at an event and talking to the audience there, who were largely kind of heads of marketing, CMOs in digital and tech companies, and explaining to them about that Google did a study looking at why people make certain buying decisions online, like what causes a consumer to purchase. And they coined the term zero moment of truth. And it's all about that point at which a person makes that positive decision. And they discovered that to get that positive decision in that zero moment of truth, a person needs to feel like they really trust you, they know and trust you. And to do that, they need to spend 7 hours with you across 11 touch points and across 4 different locations. But the great thing is those 7 hours don't need to be in person. It's not 7 hours of business lunches and time on the golf course and all of that. The 7 hours can be through content, so spending time with you. And then I think the 11 touch points in 4 locations is really important. So this could be spending time with you through listening to your podcast, watching your videos on YouTube, always reading your weekly newsletter, following your LinkedIn content, enjoying your tweets or your Insta stories and things like that. So I've mentioned different locations there. And I've mentioned different touch points there as well. And that could all accumulate to people spending around about 7 hours with you and feeling like they trust you way more because you are popping up in these different places. And if you're doing your content correctly, you're popping up with consistent messaging, consistent brand. And that's when it all builds up to that positive, zero moment of truth. So when we're working with businesses and we're trying to help them with that, to help get that positive reaction, whether it's a purchase or just that CTA, like booking that discovery call, or that action that they need people to take, how are you spending time with your audience for them to trust you? And it needs to be more than one location. I'm just putting content on my website isn't really going to cut it. And I don't think I'm just putting content on my website and occasionally updating our LinkedIn page cuts it really either. We need those locations, we need those touch points, and we need the hours to build up. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing, I guess, more businesses really starting to appreciate that and wanting to embrace different formats, different locations, but absolutely only where they know their audience are. That can be a big mistake, obviously focusing on the wrong places. But yeah, I think more and more, and good for us, like, because that's what the businesses we want to work with, we are seeing that realization that things have changed, especially during and post pandemic as well. With people, the way people consume content and the content that businesses can and should be creating to make the most of what is now available and all of that.
How do you then manage all of those metrics? How do you then combine them into something that's easy to see, easy to explain to people that aren't necessarily in the nuts and bolts of the marketing and content strategy, and present those to those sort of champions and C-suite that we discussed at the beginning of the podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when you're creating different content for different platforms, different format types, things like that, you need to just look at what metrics and what data is available. So if you're launching a podcast, as we are on a podcast now, people will automatically be looking for things like, well, how many people are listening to it? So you can get those podcast downloads, and how many have we had more visits to the website, and looking at website data and things like that. And then we might slice and dice this up and create content for different social platforms. So I think when you're doing that and you're creating content for these different platforms, like putting the video onto YouTube, putting a podcast onto a podcast hosting platform, creating videos that will go onto Instagram or LinkedIn, first thing I think is just to look at, well, how would we normally measure content on those platforms? Like, regardless of whether this is sort of, broken down, repurposed content, things like that, how would we normally measure whether we're doing the right things on LinkedIn? Are we getting shares? Are we getting likes? Are we getting comments? Are we getting traffic from LinkedIn to our website? Are people following the calls to action? Or on our website, what's the most visited pages, and are they becoming high converting pages? What's the conversion rate on those pages? Things like that. So I don't think it creates sort of new metrics, so to speak, when you're following that kind of approach of creating content and then creating kind of more content from it. I think it's just looking at what's available, but finding the way to tie everything back to the bigger pieces of content. So if you do a webinar, for example, and you get stakeholder support to put a lot of time and effort into producing and creating and sharing this webinar, which does take a fair amount of time, and let's say that you get 50 people to attend that live webinar, and you could therefore declare that you got 50 people to attend, and maybe from that you got, let's say you're a service-based business and you got 5 people from that 50 that signed up to see like a discovery call or a demo, whatever call to action may be, and that you declare that metric as being significant, and then one becomes a sale. But then what if you then maximize that webinar? So if you also put that webinar onto YouTube and you saw that that video got 2,000 views on YouTube, and that you stripped the audio from it and it became a podcast on your podcast episode on your podcast, and you got 2,000 downloads and listens to that podcast, and it also got repurposed into a blog post and you got 20,000 views to that page of your website, and you also turn it into some short content, and you've got across different platforms few thousand shares, comments, likes, things like that, and then you add all of that up and you add all of that extra data. So this is what you have to do. You have to measure back and say, well, on its own, it was this. but through maximizing and embracing different platforms and different formats and things like that, we also reached another 50,000 people through the views, the downloads, this, that. And through that, we've seen an increase in downloads of the particular call to action, or people booking in for the calls and things like that. So I think it's about, you have to you do have to really cleverly kind of measure things back in terms of it's tracing the content, I suppose. It's tracing what you created, tracing the content that was created from it, not measuring it differently, but just measuring it in the same way as you would for anything on that platform in terms of how successful it was. But it's part of a bigger campaign. So it's measuring kind of the campaign overall. So I think when you're communicating the success of this campaign, for example, to senior leadership and things like that, maybe people outside of marketing, you do just have to say it from that campaign perspective, that viewpoint of what this led to at a higher level and what the outputs were, and making it clear what it would have been, but what it was through embracing more of a multimedia approach. So that's certainly what I recommend. But I mean, as I mentioned earlier as well, always remembering the things that can't be measured so well. So there's quantitative as well as qualitative and quantitative measures, and just remembering both of those, and being able to communicate with the stakeholders or qualitative outputs as well, and explanation of how that ties back to the ultimate business strategy of the qualitative outputs too. So I think it's quite complicated and it can be quite challenging, and I know it can be quite hard to get stakeholder buy-in if you don't manage to nail all of this, but I think it's all available. It's just finding the best way to present it at an understandable level, I guess.
It's joining the dots across everything.
It is.
Siloed approaches.
Mm.
I was just going to ask you more on that qualitative approach, because obviously we've seen it, and I'm sure you've seen it with numerous clients, that you do a webinar or a podcast and you can be invited to speak at somewhere else, and then you can sort of be invited to go and do a webinar over abroad or a big trade show or something like that. And then business comes off the back of that, which is very difficult to measure, but obviously is part of the wider content strategy, because that would, without the organic content at the beginning, that wouldn't have happened. But again, how would you go about trying to feed that back into that sort of jigsaw of reporting, as we discussed in the last question?
It's just a case of kind of sitting down and working it out, I think, really. And it's just such a good point. So for example, we have quite a few clients, but I'm thinking of a particular client who, in launching a podcast for his business, the main reason for the podcast, as well as having more interesting and insightful and thoughtful content to be sharing across platforms and on the website, was to interview people and get to speak to people who were ideal clients, people who they had been trying to probably get in touch with many times, and I hadn't managed to have much luck when offering up, would you be willing to have a meeting so we can tell you a bit more about what we do and how we can help you, but reaching out and mentioning that they have a podcast and this is who it's for, and they'd be an ideal guest, and then managing to have these conversations. So that was the play. Number one business priority was to sit down and have conversations with ideal target clients. That was the business priority, and to nurture the relationship with that person thereafter, because you've initially had a conversation, try and nurture and keep that going, and ultimately try and convert that into business. And then the side benefits, fringe benefits, were the content, that it was also a good conversation that became a podcast, YouTube video, social media content, etc. But that wasn't the main key intention. And so, not that this happened because it's a very successful show, but if nobody had listened to the podcast, that still would have meant that they had a huge amount of success from the podcast, because at the end of the year, our client was able to tie back the contracts that had been signed through the business as a result of meeting that person on the podcast, and then ending up having a follow-up conversation because they got on well, and he managed to explain a bit more about what he did at the start and the end of the podcast, and managed to do business. So I think our client said in his first year, he could attribute over 500,000 of sales, he was a small business, so that was a huge amount for a small business, to his podcast straight away, because he could just link that we signed these 3 contracts, and I would never have signed those 3 contracts if I hadn't had the podcast interview in the first place with that person, who ultimately ended up working with us, and they referred us to them, and then we work with them now, through all these contracts, all this revenue is coming in. But I guess, with that, it is really, isn't it, just a case of sitting down and working it out. But I think like if you are managing if you have spreadsheets and things like that. So we track all this stuff at Content 10x in terms of if we have a spreadsheet where we know each person that we're having conversations with, and we can tick whether a referral, where they came from, and things like that. We can quite quickly say in a year we got this amount of revenue from referrals, this amount from like Google, this amount. I'm sure most businesses can. So it's just about, I suppose, like tying back to conversations and relationships and things like that as well, and tagging all of that onto the content. So it might be the case that you run a podcast series, and then after the podcast series you choose the guests that you want to get in front of a bit more, get to speak to a bit more. So if the 20 guests, you then invite 4 of them back for a podcast, a webinar series or something like that, or a virtual event, and then invite them to come and speak at your event, if an in-person event, and then you've met them in person as well, and the relationship is getting even stronger. And that's what we see happening. So like for content, opening the doors and the gateway to relationships, as well as providing great content for your audience. And I guess you measure that the way any salesperson measures relationship tracking. I'm not a salesperson, but the ways that you measure a relationship, I'm sure, are well documented in sales training and things like that.
It's a really interesting avenue, and I think that example is really great in terms of, if you just looked at the surface of it and said, well, you got 10 listens, it's not been successful. But then when you dig deeper, you get all of that. It shows that sort of some of the metrics, you need to dig deeper. You can't just take them on face value.
Yeah. And just another point on that as well is that I think with some types of content as well, patience is a really, really important word as well, because it could be that you have 10 listens, so you could declare it to have not been a good return on investment, because someone could say, oh, that was a waste of time, all that time and effort, 10 listens. And then someone says, well, hold on a minute though, but that conversation was amazing, and I'm meeting him for lunch next week actually, and then a month or so later you end up doing business, so it was worth it. But then patience is key, because 10 listens today, but then as the show, say it's a podcast is the example, the show starts to get traction and more people start to listen, it takes a while. Like, we find that podcasts take quite some time to start to really pick up and gain traction. Then in, I don't know, 6 months from now, then look at how many people have listened to that episode. And it might now be 1,000 people, from 10 to 1,000, because they're always available. And if they're in an evergreen, still useful today as they were last year or whatever, you just notice that everything starts to go up. So you have to keep looking back at those metrics of things like, podcast episodes and all of that, because when a person discovers a podcast and they really like it, they will typically binge. So they might listen to that one and think, God, I really like that. I wonder what other episodes they have, and often just then start at the start and start working the way to the future, or jumping around looking at guests and things like that. So you have to be super patient as well. I think that is really important. And that's why it's important to maximize in the moment, to get the most in the moment, and then have the patience to look at those metrics over time as well, and see that it can really make a difference as the show and the content gets more popular.
And do you think that communication of patience and that ongoing review of metrics is something that you need to set out at the beginning when you're looking at the business goals and everything?
Yeah, I think so. I think it is so important to manage that with people who are looking, especially if there's anyone kind of expecting to see really quick immediate results and things like that. You have to have people on board that these types of content are the long play. But as I said, through good like maximization of longer form content, you can promise some quick wins. So through like the repurposing and things like that, you can say, well, it will also ensure that we're feeding X posts a week to this channel, X posts a week to that channel, things like that. But with these particular metrics, we need to have patience, like that these are the metrics that will grow over time and things like that. But yeah, I think it's really, really, really important. And certainly when I speak to, potential clients or people we're going to work with, and I get a feeling of impatience and a lack of understanding, of content marketing overall, that's a massive red flag. If there's ever sort of discussions like, well, how quickly will that go viral or something like that, it's like, no. Don't think we understand what we're talking about here. But yeah, it's a challenging one, and I think if you feel like if you're struggling to get stakeholder buy-in for longer term content marketing approaches with really impatient stakeholders, then you have to wait until you get the right buy-in or look at a different approach, because otherwise it's unlikely to work. And people often give up at the point at which they don't see results and get bored, just at the point at which if they were just going to just kind of push on and keep going, the results were probably on the cusp as well. So that can be quite frustrating as well.
Talking of maximizing content in the moment, and let's take a podcast video, for example, again, snippet videos, sharing sort of little quotes, 2-minute videos on social from the podcast. We're starting to see a trend of sort of zero-click content, where actually people aren't putting the links into the where you can download it or where you can go and watch the full episode. Why are we sort of seeing this beginning to happen more and more, and how does that help drive engagement of those things if there is no actionable CTA?
The good thing about zero click content, there's a couple of ways that people look at it. So like Amanda Natividad, who is quite well known in the B2B marketing space, talks a lot about zero click content, and I had her on my podcast, and the way she defined it was probably a little bit different to us, because her definition of zero click content was quite often that it does still have a link in it, so it will still have a place to click to, but you don't need to get value from the content. So instead of providing a bit of a tease, so teasing the video but almost holding back the punchline, or there's 2 tips, for the 3rd tip you're going to have to click the link below, and that kind of tease. Her point was, deliver everything up. It's a full, true value piece of content, but then you can still have the link there, but you haven't held back, so to speak. So people can still stay on the platform, get value from it. They could click, or they, don't click. For me, I would go further to say that I think, zero click content should even not have a link at all. So just be a piece of content with no link, that's valuable, just valuable in platform content. And the reason for this, so if you have the no link piece of content, then so platform experts say, and certainly from what we see, you're more likely to get more favor from the social media platforms, because of course their sole intention is to keep as many people as possible on their platform. And when you start just posting something basically just saying, hey, like, go over here, that's not useful to them. I mean, it's like, going into somebody's shop and just shouting, hey, there's another shop over there that's better. That shop is not going to particularly like you, and they're probably just going to tell you to get out of the shop now and stop being annoying. So that, they see it like that. So you can get diminished reach if you were putting links in. So like the zero click content where there's still a link, but you don't have to click it, it's kind of a 50-50 approach, because you could still get penalized by the platform if you put the link in. Now, one thing that can happen is if you are serving up content that's purely, for helping and value, and not with any call to action as such, then it's all about brand awareness. So I think you have to we talked about this a lot, but get stakeholders involved in understanding and realizing that it is okay to not always have, a measurable CTA and trackable link, and a way to attribute how that would link to the bigger strategy. You have to get people to realize as a marketing team that brand awareness posts in their own right without calls to action are acceptable and should be a part of your strategy, and there's nothing wrong with them, and post them out onto your social channels. And then obviously your audience see that it's pure value and not asking for anything in return, which is good from brand perception and audience building perspective. But another thing as well is that if you share quite a lot of zero click, non call to action, just high value or entertainment or whatever it is content, with no desire to send them anywhere else, then the times when you do then share a piece of content that has a call to action, and you've kind of built the algorithm in to see that you like to keep people on their platform, you start to get more reach with your zero click posts and things like that. When you occasionally then have posts with links, you're likely to get more reach from it, because the platform is generally giving you more reach anyway, because you don't have links in your posts. And you'll probably see a higher click rate as well, because you're not persistently asking people to click somewhere that it almost becomes a bit like white noise. So when you occasionally do have that valuable post that does have a call to action, there's just more likelihood that you'll see a bigger reach and potentially a higher click-through rate as well. So I think, I think a lot of people are just realizing that a bit of a tease and a go elsewhere to find more isn't really what people want, and not what the platforms want either.
So when you're reporting back on those, it sounds like if you couple up the CTA piece of content with the zero click content and almost look at them as one wider piece of content, rather than saying there's no metrics on the zero click content, but actually it's done X, Y, and Z for this piece of content.
I think so. I think it's a good experiment to look at if you hold back on your click content and see the reach of that, and start doing it over time and seeing if you're starting to get more reach on those posts. And then, look at the others and see if you therefore then get more reach and clicks on the clickable ones. But also just coming back to, I think it is just a big like stakeholder engagement as well, to explain that it is okay to post content on social that doesn't have click links and will not be measurable apart from the in platform metrics of looking at comments, likes and shares. So you can measure them together and look at how things change as you start to follow that approach over time. And also like really fly the flag as a content marketing team within the organization that it is okay to have brand awareness posts and not be under pressure to constantly have a metric with each link associated with it.
It's really interesting, and I think we're starting to see it come to the fore. I'm expecting to see a lot more of it this year. And just speaking on that, are there any things that you really expect to see, not just in content, but within marketing as a whole, that are really going to sort of catch fire over the next sort of 12 to 18 months, or anything that you've seen happening that you want people to do more of?
I think as we're, talking a lot about marketing data, I think that we'll likely see more personalization and hyper targeting. So, more data available for marketing teams, giving them more chance to personalize the messaging and more chance to have targeted campaigns with that more personalized messaging. But then I think hand in hand with more personalization and more hyper targeting available, we'll probably see even more of a focus on the privacy data side of things as well. Obviously, we've got GDPR over here in Europe, but it'd be interesting to see how that starts to, things start to get a bit stricter in outside of Europe as well. I also think, AI, machine learning, everyone in the content world seems to be talking about ChatGPT at the moment an awful lot. But I think in the different ways that AI can help, when looking at analysing data for your marketing efforts, I definitely think that we'll see AI playing more of a role in identifying and analysing data and helping to spot patterns in the data that we have in our marketing data, and then asking AI to assist with the analysis and spotting patterns, and therefore helping to make some predictions on the future based on what we see has been happening. So I think they're like big things as well. And something that interests me is one other thing would be around conversational marketing and also voice search, because more and more homes these days have got smart speakers. In fact, like many smart speakers, and voice search and voice assistants and things like that are becoming like just mainstream part of everyday life for a lot of households and people and families, etc. So I'd just be interested more from a like intrigue perspective, really, to see how how people can optimize content, how businesses can optimize their content for voice search and how they can develop that conversational marketing strategy that takes voice searching. But then if you're going to take advantage of those channels and optimize it, the way to then obviously measure it back as well and see how that is all working. So absolutely not something that I have the expertise in, like optimizing the voice search content, but I'm definitely keen to see how that plays in this year, and probably looping back to the AI comments as well that I made in terms of how people incorporate AI into all of that.
The voice search one is super interesting, especially because you remove that discoverability phase. So actually you remove that choice of the consumer being able to scroll through different pages, read about different stuff. So yeah, how you optimize that to be at the fore is the $1 million question, right?
Super interesting, isn't it? Yeah, exactly. So and voice, it's just huge, isn't it? Like in my household, we have 5 Alexa devices. It's just mad, isn't it? So it's huge and it's interesting, and I'm really keen to see how that progresses. Sure, this time next year things will look a lot different in that space.
Do you think that the rise of voice has linked to the rise in sort of podcasting and a video first approach, and people are becoming a lot more aware and actually a lot more sort of comfortable with getting their information through listening rather than reading than it was sort of 5-10 years ago?
Yeah, I think so. I quite avidly follow the annual report that comes out by Edison Research called the Infinite Dial, and they do there's a few different type aspects to the report, but they look at all of this. They look at voice and smart search and things that I just said, like the rise of smart speakers, how many in a household, how much people use them, and they look at audio as well. So not just podcasts, they look at, like music and where, in cars, in households, things like that, and the percentage of different ages and demographics that are using podcasts, things like that. And it's all on the rise. I wouldn't say that like the podcasting shot up and then is kind of more incrementally going up, I would say, over the last few years. It kind of went higher during the pandemic, but everyone's habits and behaviors were so different, weren't they? Like, you went from just that like daily commute and listening to podcasts to not having a daily commute anymore. So you just sort of stopped listening because you didn't have a daily commute anymore, but you started doing something differently. And I think it all went a bit strange during that time. It was a bit more unpredictable, but it seems to be coming more back onto a like slightly more of a trend, I suppose, like an upward trend. But yeah, you see those numbers going up, number of smart speakers, number of people who would go to voice search, like what would you first go to if you wanted to know this? And most people saying voice search, things like that. And it's definitely going up with the audio books as well, audio books, podcasts, people turning to listen. And I also think that people get screen fatigue more these days. And I definitely think, if this was like a during and more closely post-pandemic thing, I would definitely be saying more screen fatigue, all the Zoom calls and all of the people working from home, so like if you are working from home, working remotely and not in the offices, things like that, you are, I think, spending a bit more time on screen because of things like Zoom calls and stuff. So then looking at different ways to learn and consume content that breaks your eyes from the screen and are turning to audio books, podcasts, and then linking that to suddenly, like you said, then having more audio devices in houses, and then getting information from audio as well. And I guess you can only really see it in the younger people coming up as well, because I've got young kids, but whenever they want to know anything, they just shriek at the Alexa, what is the Man United score? As soon as I say Alexa, it's going to go off. What is the Man United score? How tall is the biggest dinosaur, and things like that. That's all. They're only little, but they see that as the place that you go to whenever there's an argument in the house. Alexa solves that argument most of the time in an instant. And you see it and you just think, well, if that's what they're like, imagine what it's going to become.
Just before we let you go, have you got any sort of advice that you would want to pass on to someone starting in the industry, or anything that you wish you had known earlier in your career? Obviously you've shifted from that sort of management consultant background, so any learnings that you've taken out of that, or anything you would say to your younger self?
I think I would say to make sure that you're always focusing on the business problem that you're trying to solve, and not just the data or analytics themselves. So data and analytics are valuable, and they can help you make better business decisions. But sometimes you can get lost in the data analysis and like lose that step back of actually remembering what is the problem that you're trying to solve for your organization. So I think it's just always have those step back moments of focusing on the business problem that you're trying to solve, and then making sure that you don't get swayed too much by information available and things like that that just take you down avenues that sway a little bit further away from the business problem that you're trying to solve. And also making sure that you break those business problems down as well. So rarely can one big one be solved in one way. You need to break them down. So I think it's breaking down the business problems and knowing that just because data and analytics is available shouldn't always distract you from going slightly off course.
Brilliant. Amy, thank you so much for your time, and look forward to having another chat in season 2.
Yep, thank you so much. It's been great to be on the show. So thanks, JJ.